you began to plant the seed in people's minds. But I think in the process, you did create a media image of me that's far beyond, the reality of me.
And this craving, this awful, raging, eating feeling inside. I could feel it consuming my insides. It was overwhelming me.
Hello again, and welcome to Serial Killing, a podcast. My name is Elissa Kerrill, and I am the host, writer, editor, all of the things. Over here, we talk about all manner of true crime at this point, but we also get the whole picture to fully explore the nature versus nurture aspect of people who commit these horrible crimes. If that's your kink, then you've come to the right place. Subscribe, like, follow. Everything that you need is in the notes. And also just a quick reminder that if you loved Monday Morning Murder in the News or Friday Morning Murder in the News is now been split off into its own thing. A lot of you have swapped right over, and I super appreciate that so much. But in case you forgot, it's separate. It's just under Serial Killing, Murder in the News. Literally what it's called. The thumbnail is the same kind of sickly, putrid, disgusting, like dead body green that I was going for with the one that you see on this one. That's the Raven. So I just want to let you know, if you still want to listen to Murder in the News, it's on its own little thing over there. Over here, we're keeping it a little more professional. All right. So this week's podcast will be on the cult, Aum Shinrinkyo. And I'm excited to dive into this one, actually. I've wanted to cover this one for years, but I've just taken other requests. And so here we are, and let's jump right in. So apologies in advance if and when I mispronounce Japanese names. I never mean any disrespect. Okay, so our story starts, right, with a boy named Chizuo Matsumoto. He was born on March 2nd, 1955 in Yatsushiro, Japan, which is in the very southern region of Japan. This region, it is said, has a warm and humid subtropical climate with only cool winters. I very much enjoy looking up the weather of regions too. Fun fact. So there is apparently a significant amount of rain that falls there, but the internet said it doesn't really get hotter than 85 degrees. With the humidity, that would suck, but it still sounds lovely. So what was going on in the world in 1955 when Matsumoto was born? Well, this is the year that West Germany joined NATO. This is only a decade after World War II had ended, and this is in Japan, right? Need I say more? And as a counter to that, the Soviet Union and 7 other European countries formed the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance to counter NATO. Germany was still very much divided between the Allies and the Soviets. It was a whole thing. But also in 1955, Argentina removed dictator Juan Perón from power. The U.S. began sending $216 million in aid to Vietnam. And I did not even do the math to see what that is in today's money, but it's a lot. Of course, we would be headed into the Vietnam War after this, but enough of war. The first McDonald's fast food burger store opened this year. We also had the first domestic microwave oven, and the polio vaccine came into existence this year. Jim Henson introduced the first version of Kermit the Frog in 1955. Albert Einstein died this year, which sucks, but Disneyland opened in California. So there was quite a lot going on in 1955. Now, from what I read, Matsumoto was the 4th son out of 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls. His father was said to have made tatami mats, which are these really beautiful Japanese traditional kind of soft flooring. So when Matsumoto was born, or shortly after anyway, it was discovered that he had infantile glaucoma. So a quick description for those who might not know what that is. Okay, so it's a rare eye condition that is present at birth or develops very early. It's due to improper drainage of the eye fluids, which leads to increased pressure inside the eye, known as intraocular pressure. This higher pressure can damage the optic nerve, which will result in permanent vision loss. So, kind of important. he was completely blind in his left eye. He was partially blind in his right eye. And now it was said that his family was quite poor. That making floor mats didn't pay that well, right? So his family struggled. But they made the best of it. And then when he was 6 years old, his father sent him to a school for the blind that had a dormitory, and that is where he lived. It was said to have not been very close to his home either. It was discovered rather quickly that the boy had a talent for holding sway over the other children at the school. It was said that he was the only one that had some level of vision, and this made him very popular amongst the other kids. But he was quite savvy in that he would also apparently lead children to a candy store, and somehow he made money doing this. But a few years in, at this school, it was said that he used his perceived power, if you want to call it that, to bully the other kids. And it was said that he would be physically aggressive to the point that he actually beat some other kids. And then he was also known to extort money. Not good. And then during his teen years, sources said that Matsumoto began living in a bit of a fantasy world, right, where he ruled over an entire kingdom of robots, might I add, that he would have complete and total control over. He also would tell the other few kids that would socialize with him that he wanted to rule Japan as prime minister. Now, this, of course, would never happen due to how, at least at that time when he was a child, that kids with disabilities simply weren't, they really held no social status at all. But let me explain. So this is coming from the Journal of the International Institute, okay? In the later 1800s, the Japanese government established an educational system that provided mandatory education for their citizens. The Japanese, however, did not include the handicapped, who were referred to as, quote, worthless, useless people. Not my words. Dear God, no. So this stigma severely limited educational opportunities for handicapped students. Any formal education for these kids could only be found in private schools started by charity organizations and or religious philanthropists. The Kumamoto School for the Blind, where Matsumoto went, was one of these schools. Most graduates of this school earned their living as acupuncturists or specialists in Chinese medicine. Asian medicine has been the most important subject of study in modern education for the blind, and it is a very, very old tradition over there. So as Matsumoto was getting into his upper teens, it was said that he really didn't want to fall into these stereotypical jobs because of his near total blindness. So when he graduated high school, or the Japanese equivalent of that, respectfully of course, he decided to move to Tokyo, the big city, and try to get enrolled in Tokyo University, and his decided major would have been politics. Needless to say, he was denied enrollment. And that was his childhood, guys. We don't have a lot of super detailed info, but there's some to work with. So he was most definitely born during a pretty big time in somewhat recent history, with World War II having ended not too long before this, and considering what had happened with the 2 bombs in Japan, right? I don't think that it would be that far off to think that his mother might have experienced some higher than average stress during her pregnancies. We can't know, of course, but it is at least probable, if not highly plausible. World War II messed people up for a while. For those who are of the younger generation and just finding your love of history, the whole world stood up and paid attention at the end of that war, World War II. It was scary, scary stuff. Matsumoto was born nearly completely blind, entirely blind in one eye and very limited sight in the other. And as I read to you, in Japan's history, they didn't really put much stock in people with disabilities. And he was a son, much more highly coveted than a daughter, but he was disabled. Now again, we have no way of knowing whether or not Matsumoto's father was ashamed of him or not. And I'd like to think not, but we don't know. He had other sons, so perhaps there just wasn't that shame lingering in the air. He had plenty of sons. But what we do know is that clearly he would have required a lot more care and attention as a child. His care would have also been more expensive, and the family was already struggling. And of course, he would have no other real educational opportunities, so his father sent him to a school that could accommodate his disability, and that's fine. This tells us that his family loved him at least enough to want the best for him under the circumstances and societal pressures. We didn't hear anything about any sibling rivalry, but again, he was living full-time at his school from the age of 6. So there wasn't a lot of time for him to develop any of that with his siblings. I also don't want to throw away the fact that he was sent to a school far enough away from home and his family, that he stated that a couple of times out loud in his adulthood, meaning that that was a trauma. But once he was at the school, immediately we begin to see some behaviors that no one would call pro-social. Nearly right off the bat, he's using what small advantage he had over the other blind students, again because he had some partial vision in one eye, to his advantage. He swindled them out of their money, and as he became physically bigger and stronger, well, he flat out began physically hurting his peers. This has now crossed into more antisocial behavior. Now, I can't say for sure if he was conduct disordered or meeting the criteria for that or anything, because we just don't have enough information. But the fascinating thing about having complete control over robots, the fantasizing about it, or humanoid forms that he would not have to interact with or try to get along with or have any level of social grace, it's telling. It was his way or the highway, and robots are, of course, emotionless. They don't need human interaction or care, and will do whatever is commanded of them for now, you little heathens. But how convenient for him that he would never have to worry about them trying to interact with them, or him having to compromise in any social way or care for them or anything. Just blind obedience under his complete control. How very foretelling. He was already practicing exerting his control over his peers and fantasizing about having that control over an entire kingdom. So let's get back into it. So Matsumoto went to a form of community college and learned about acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine, as was the easiest route for him to take. And at least it was something that he could do. It was very well respected, both are very well respected industries. He then opened his own Chinese medicine shop just outside of Tokyo. He made herbal remedies and ran a sort of pharmacy for a while. In 1974, he married a woman named Kazuko, and they went on to have a total of 6 children, the first being born in 1978 when Matsumoto was 23 years old. And there for a while, life was okay. He made enough money to support his wife and children, and all was decent. He started exploring other religions and educating himself, but then he was arrested in 1982 because he was making, basically fake remedies, selling snake oil, those miracle cures you see commercials for in the middle of the night for one of the one-time low price of $19.99 kind of crap. Men taking a supplement called Nugenics, as if the irony of that name alone wouldn't scare the shit out of them. Levels of fake medicine. Do you hear me? But Matsumoto got busted. Simple as that. So in 1982, he was 27 years old, and he was now arrested. And he was actually convicted of fraud, and because of that, his business went bankrupt. I did not see that he served any time, but it ruined his business nonetheless. He completed whatever his punishment was, but this incident kind of spurred on his interest in other religions and spirituality. It was said that he immersed himself into studying Chinese astrology and Taoism. Then this developed into him studying Western esotericism, yoga, meditation, esoteric Buddhism, and esoteric Christianity. So, again, just quickly, if you don't know what esoteric means, it just basically means it's really obscure, abstract, mystical, and then you just put Buddhism or Christianity after that, as in the other Gospels of the Bible that didn't make the cut. You get it. So he was looking into traditional religious or spiritual beliefs, but then he was also on the fringe parts of those beliefs. Now, ultimately, he became devoted to one of the largest of the so-called new religions in post-war Japan, and this was called Agonshu. Now, Agonshu was founded by Kiriyama Sayu and became popular in the 1970s and 80s, and it was said that it emphasized deliverance from earthly bondage, advocated transmigration of souls, or basically reincarnation. The soul inhabits a new body after death, right? And recommended practicing mental and physical asceticism to attain nirvana. Asceticism is severe self-discipline and avoidance of all forms of indulgence. Asceticism, sometimes like people will whip themselves on the back. I think it's called self-flagellation or self-flagellation. One of those is correct and one of those is wrong. But regardless, it is self-discipline and avoidance, and sometimes discipline, I suppose, all for religious reasons. Now, Matsumoto grew his hair and beard out long during this time and began practicing yoga specifically to help him be able to harness some supernatural powers. In 1984, at 29 years old, he formed a company called the Aum Shinrinkyo, which was a yoga school and publishing house. Now, from various Aum publications, it appears that around 1986, he changed his own name to Shoko Asahara due to a spiritual awakening that he said he had in the Himalayas. And in 1987, the name of his yoga group he changed to the Aum Shinrinkyo. So I'm now going to call Matsumoto Asahara to save on confusion. Asahara is now his name, or Asahara is now his name. Okay, so Asahara apparently made several trips to India, and there he met the Dalai Lama. Now, when he returned from his travels, he told his followers that he had achieved enlightenment. He told them that he had actually met Shiva, which is a deity from Hinduism. He told his now growing numbers of followers that he had mastered meditation to the point that he could levitate himself off of the ground. Yes, he even produced evidence of this by making pamphlets stating such, and he even had a photo of himself, quote, levitating, that he produced by his own publishing company just outside a few Japanese periodicals with an occult subject. Little publicity was ever actually achieved. Oh, and he levitated, I can tell you how he did it, by sitting on what in my house we called crisscross applesauce, and he was either on a trampoline or some kind of tightly woven surface, and he would rock himself and he would bounce off the floor for just like a couple of inches, and the picture would be snapped in that moment. He was literally just bouncing. So in August of 1989, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government granted Aum Shinrinkyo official religious corporation status, although this was definitely after some serious picketing and bullying and a lot of stress and tension. They were finally given that. Now, this law provided the new religion various privileges, including massive tax breaks and de facto immunity from official oversight and prosecution. Under the Japanese religious corporation law, after a group is recognized, authorities are actually not permitted to investigate its, quote, religious activities or doctrine. This is broadly interpreted to cover almost everything the religious group does. But Asahara was such a charming and sort of what I call Slytherin-tongued devil, he began amassing so many followers, including apparently a considerable number of graduates from Japan's elite universities, guys. Thus, this being dubbed a religion for the elite. He grew that quickly. Now, with regards to his teachings, he kind of popped up onto the scene during a time in Japan when people were really searching for the meaning of life. There was a significant portion of the culture searching for deeper meaning. Asahara explained to his pupils how they could attain both nirvana and ESP, meaning extrasensory perception, being psychic and so on. And achieving nirvana means that you've gotten to the highest level of enlightenment and are a person totally free of suffering and desire and are reborn. It's like a state of perfect peace and happiness that nobody can achieve. Now, quoting from the Journal of the International Institute again, quote, Asahara gave his young adherents both an enemy and a dream. His doctrine was a mixture of Buddhism, Hinduism, and apocalyptic Christianity, and he often cited the prophetic writings of Nostradamus. And he predicted doom and the destruction of this world, with himself in the central role. You know, you've got this right. You know the words. He was the savior and subsequent leader of the new paradise. Of course. And while his stories were naive and far-fetched, they were also unambiguous and provided both obsessive fears and ideals for his young followers. End quote. He created little comics and cartoons mimicking the anime or manga kind of vibe to rather successfully recruit a lot of new and young followers. And so now that he had been formally recognized as a religion and he had gathered thousands of people, this is when it was said that his whole demeanor and personality, or the way he presented himself, changed. Once the Japanese government gave him basically free rein, right? It was all she wrote. He was able to build this into a whole huge enterprise that, at its peak, was worth nearly $1 billion with a B. B as in boy. But at the same time, it was said that he became obsessed with biblical prophecy, as so many cults wind up doing, and the doomsday prediction nonsense thusly began. His original message was the quest for the ultimate truth. Soon his teachings were called, and he referred to himself as the Spirit of Truth, His Holiness the Master Shoko Asahara. He published magazines, the whole thing. And again, he built an entire empire so fast. The cult was fixated on the Hindu god Shiva, as I mentioned earlier, and this was significant since Shiva is the god of destruction, thereby explaining, at least in part, the violent nature of the cult and its particular emphasis on Armageddon, or the end of days, the end of times. And although the concept of Armageddon is widely known in Western regions, Armageddon, or the end of the world, is not a normal kind of belief or canon of Buddhism especially, or other Eastern religions popular in Japan at the time. You see? However, it was a core element in the Aum religion, with salvation only coming at the end of Armageddon to those who adopted the Aum faith. Asahara foretold salvation for those Aum members who have attained a higher state through the teachings of the Supreme Master. And guess who that was? Yeah, Asahara. He also preached salvation even to those of his members who might otherwise perish in the predicted Armageddon, since they were assured a special status in their reincarnated state. So don't worry, folks. Don't worry. In 1989, 34-year-old Asahara published a major religious paper on Armageddon called The Destruction of the World. In it, Asahara apparently described a worldwide calamity of sorts based upon a supposed future war between Japan and the United States, which would start sometime in 1997. Again, it was only 1989 when he said this. Asahara based his predictions on, quote, the prophecies of Nostradamus, who we know he preached about. He also referred back to the revelations of St. John from the New Testament, Buddhist scriptures, other personal revelations, and there we were. So we're beginning to see the checklist of, is this a cult? Getting some check marks. The end of the world is coming. Check. He is the only qualified person that can help you survive or endure or be reborn after, or what have you, the end of the world. Check. He makes himself into a Christ-like figure. Check. Other recruitment activities, which he called the Aum Salvation Plan, included him boasting that he could cure physical illnesses with health improvement techniques, guide people through realizing their life goals by improving intelligence and positive thinking, and concentrating on what was important at the expense of leisure. These efforts resulted in Aum being able to recruit a variety of people, from your everyday poor, everyday Joe, all the way up to freaking government officials. And I wish I were joking. There were, of course, initiation rituals, because why wouldn't there be? And they included feeding people LSD or other hallucinogens, and the yoga practice became intense, and then that spilled into severe, where there was this very intense self-discipline and abstinence from any pleasures in life. And it was very, very strict, very reclusive. He even began having people just hang upside down for lengths of time to the very extreme, and then even using electric shocks on people. The group was taught, and they thoroughly believed, that if people listened to the truth, or Asahara's truth anyway, the masses could come swiftly, or the masses would come swiftly to the group and join the cult, and thus they would be saving the world. He set himself up and referred to himself as the second coming of Christ, as well as the only other actually enlightened being since Buddha. His scriptures, one follower said that if you truly believed that scripture, it made Asahara out to be a saint, like an actual saint. He preached that if they truly believed in him, he would transfer spiritual powers to them. Only he himself could absolve them from their own sin. And make no mistake, he would also bleed every new member completely dry of every penny they had, and this in turn made him a very, very globally rich man very quickly. People were joining up in astonishing numbers, and it was said that most of them were just people who saw the trajectory of their lives as what I can certainly empathize with. We can all empathize with this. The wake up, to work, to go home, to eat, to go to bed. Rinse and repeat life that is unrewarding and unfulfilling. They wanted something more, and he promised that. In Aum's initiations, sources said that Asahara told his followers that he was genetically superior to others. He forced Aum believers to act like his slaves. He went as far as to call them his clones. So stripping them of their own identity, right? There's another cult checklist thing, check. At one point, Asahara even asked them to drink his blood. Oh, and the Aum were also very anti-Semitic, very anti-Jewish, which I will never understand as long as I am alive. But it was said that much of that was just a lack of a specific target for their hatred, so they just chose the Jewish people because, sure, that's just logical. I will never get it. I will never get it. Now, this began escalating to hits being ordered or murder plots carried out. Guns and weapons began to be gathered, and the cash built up to varying, worrying numbers. The money he was making hand over fist was also going into building communes for his followers, promising a sort of utopia. All of these buildings, warehouses, the real estate guys is crazy. But behind the scenes, he and his followers got themselves into the drug trade and had huge stockpiles of methamphetamine and were selling wholesale levels of this shit to the Japanese cartels. No, I'm still not joking. This new religion was just a cult and a criminal enterprise at this point. They were attempting to, and I believe successful at, importing these weapons from Russia. Asahara even got as bold as to order a hit on a man and his family due to the man, who happened to be a lawyer, was bringing a class action lawsuit against Asahara and the Aum cult. There was a television interview with the lawyer, but this was secretly shown to the cult before it was aired to the public. So several days later, on November 3rd, 1989, several cult members, including a chief scientist, a martial arts master, and others, drove to where the lawyer lived. They carried a pouch with 14 hypodermic needles and a supply of potassium chloride with the intention of kidnapping him from his train station. But it was a holiday, so he hadn't gone to work. 2 days later, they let themselves into his home through an unlocked door. The lawyer was hit over the head with a hammer and injected with potassium chloride. He was then strangled to death. His wife and son were also injected and then murdered. Their bodies put in metal drums and abandoned in random places, apart from each other. They apparently smashed all of the victims' teeth to prevent identification, then threw their tools and weapons into the ocean. Their remains would not be found for another 6 years. In January of 1995, the cult began printing very anti-American and anti-Japanese government articles, and this was becoming very concerning. This raised the cult to terrorist levels, and as the cult began to get the inevitable lawsuits, the real attacks began. Asahara just wanted to be the prime minister, and that was obvious that that was not going to happen. One night in June of 1994, he instructed his cult members to carry out a chemical weapons attack against civilian people, and so they did. They released sarin in the central Japanese city of Matsumoto, Nagano. Sarin is a man-made chemical warfare nerve agent. It is one of the most toxic and fast-acting nerve agents, in fact. Aum Shinrinkyo had two goals for this: to attack 3 judges who were expected to rule against the cult in a lawsuit concerning a real estate dispute, as well as the locals who opposed him building a facility there, and to also, second reason, test the efficacy of its sarin, which the cult was manufacturing at one of its facilities as a weapon of mass murder in the form of an aerosol. Well, after they released that, the emergency calls came rushing in. So people were experiencing darkened vision, eye pain, headaches, nausea, diarrhea, meiosis or constricted pupils, and numbness in their hands. One victim was in a coma for 14 years before he finally died. I mean, this was no joke, but the testing of the poison had been a success. And then there had also been some high-level assassinations planned out, but it was on the morning of March 20th, 1995, that changed everything. Aum cult members were directed to release what was called a binary chemical weapon, chemically most closely similar to sarin, on 5 trains in the Tokyo subway system. The footage of this and the sick and dying people is eye-opening, if you want to give that a little YouTube. This attack killed 13 commuters, seriously injured 54, and affected 980 more. Now, some estimates claim as many as 6,000 people were injured by the sarin, but the number could be higher, but they don't really know because a lot of people just didn't want to come forward. Later, prosecutors said that Asahara was tipped off by an insider about some very real, planned police raids on cult facilities and ordered an attack in central Tokyo to divert police attention away from the group. The attack clearly backfired, and police conducted huge simultaneous raids on cult compounds across the country. At one facility, the authorities found explosives, chemical warfare weapons, and a Russian Mi-17 military helicopter. They actually found enough sarin to kill roughly 4 million people. The head of Aum's Ministry of Science was then stabbed to death in retaliation outside the cult's Tokyo headquarters amidst a crowd of about 100 reporters and in front of the cameras. The killer had been from a Korean group. So arrests began to take place as the most dangerous cult members were rounded up. Asahara decided to try to hide, Charlie Manson style, but he was found hiding within a wall of one of his cult buildings on May 16th and was arrested. And on the same day, the cult mailed a bomb to the office of Yukio Oashima, the governor of Tokyo at the time, blowing off the fingers of his secretary's hand. Asahara faced 27 counts of murder in 13 separate indictments. The prosecution argued that Asahara gave orders to attack the Tokyo subway to, quote, overthrow the government and install himself in a position of emperor of Japan. In February of 2004, because yes, it took years and years to get the trial done and over with, Asahara was given the death sentence. Asahara was executed by hanging at the Tokyo Detention House on July 6, 2018, along with 6 other cult members. Now, I remember when this happened. It's not an entirely clear memory, but I remember this being discussed on the news, and I remember seeing this man's face on the screen, all that long hair. He was labeled a pathological liar, to the point of disorder, to be sure. Some sources stated that he was a clear psychopath. So let's look at that, right? So did we see the famous superficial charm and glibness, the grandiose sense of self-worth, the lack of remorse or guilt, deceitfulness, manipulation, callousness, lack of empathy? Checks all across the board, you bet. He was born with a disability into a poor family, and I actually read that the eye condition had run in his family, but I couldn't find out who all had it. But there was no instances of abuse or neglect, and in fact, his father had sent him to a special school for the blind to give his son a chance at a future where he could contribute to the community and earn a living. I see no real environmental issues here other than just the stigma of being disabled in Japan back in that time. And Japan, I love you. I'm not judging you. All of our countries have some shame in our past. Every single damn one of us. I really actually hope to see Japan someday. But the point is that Asahara was the bully at school. He himself was not bullied. Seems to lean kind of more towards nature than nurture. But of course I can't be sure because I don't have super detailed information about his early childhood and so on. He did in his later teens fantasize about having his own kingdom and these mindless robots. And of course, we see a lot of that in our antisocial personality disordered serial killers or otherwise dangerous criminals. The fantasy of having ultimate power with no real responsibility. Not having to be bothered with other people's emotions and feelings, right? And so, that is the story of the cult. What did you guys think? Do you guys remember when this happened? If you are from Japan, do you have anything that you would like to add to the story that maybe I could not find or otherwise accidentally left out? By all means, share with the group. Let us know. This is how we learn. This is how we learn. Outside of that, guys, thank you so much for listening, because I know you could be listening to anyone else, and yet you guys just keep choosing me, and I really appreciate you guys. You have no idea how much. Remember, Murder in the News now is on its own thing. It's Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Audible, all the podcast platforms. It's there. Serial killing, Murder in the News. Outside of that, guys, have a fantastic evening. Goodbye.
Anybody who killed more than 2 or 3 people was a mass murderer, and whether it was all at one place or over an extended period of time. And then in the early 80s, they came up with this differentiation called serial killing.